Hello and welcome to another video about butterflies. This time we will do an introductory session about how to identify butterflies. The techniques will be generally applicable, at least for Africa, but of course our examples will be mostly South African. Because this episode is aimed mostly at newly interested people, we will use common names. Furthermore, it is a generalized session, and there will of course be exceptions, as with always with nature. But we have to start somewhere. This is also a very long session, so we have added a timeline index to help you to jump to chapters or repeat some. Why is it important for the general nature-interested public to be able to identify butterflies? I will illustrate this with a little story. Suppose someone sees an orange-tipped butterfly and a butterfly with sharp pointy tails in the garden. The next day she asks her neighbor whether she has seen the orange-tipped butterfly and a saw-tailed butterfly in her garden, to which the neighbor replies that yes, she has seen the saw-tail, but only a bright yellow butterfly. This brings us to the first reason to identify. To name a thing is to know a thing, and we need to know to better protect, or as BirdLife says, conversation precedes conservation. The second reason lies with the orange tip. One neighbor saw the orange tips, the other the bright yellow wings, but it was the same butterfly. This shows that multiple characteristics can be used to identify the butterfly. In Africa, there are well over 6,000 different species, and it is therefore almost impossible for individuals to give their own names. Thus, we have standardized lists, and species are separated based on multiple characteristics by experts, taxonomists. So we, as amateurs, must use their names, if we can pronounce them. Fortunately, for the African butterflies, each species has a common or vernacular name. One of the most important reasons to identify is because when we start to understand and differentiate, this leads to love and interest for nature. So, what do you need to identify butterflies? Curiosity and patience. Maybe a camera or binoculars, or a net and transparent container. It is useful to have a reference book or field guide, but most importantly, you need a pith helmet or other suitable field clothing, but do remember your hat and sunscreen. Many butterfly identification courses start with what is a butterfly, but truth be told, most people already know. We get shown butterflies on pictures, on advertisements, company logos, biology class, and many more. So we are not going to spend much time in differentiating butterflies from other animals in this video. Alright, let's start identifying. First, we try and find a butterfly and then slowly approach it to observe. Of course, a camera means we can do the identification at our leisure when we are back home. Many people that want to identify butterflies have already tried to identify birds. And of course, many sessions about bird identification exist. So, let's briefly look at the characteristics we use to identify birds. Almost everyone recognizes this as a swallow and this as a ground hornbill, or an albatross, a sunbird, a duck, an ostrich. But note, there was no color, no patterns, and size was not to scale. So what characteristics did we use to identify birds? We do use size, shape, plumage. And when we get to more difficult ones, we use habitat and behavior. Final checks are against distribution and seasonality. But we may only encounter sounds, nests, or eggs without actually seeing the adult. So, what characteristics do we use to identify butterflies? Almost the same. We use size, shape, color, but also habitat, behavior, and distribution, and time of year. When we consider the whole life cycle, aspects such as larval host plants, and the eggs, caterpillars and pupae are also useful. In order to assist with the characteristics, let's just refresh basic butterfly anatomy. We have 4 wings, 2 forewings and 2 hindwings. We have a head with eyes and antennae, a thorax to which the wings are attached, and an abdomen trailing behind. Other noteworthy characteristics are the proboscis and the legs. The upper sides and undersides of the wings can be very different, and one is not always lucky to view both. Sometimes just an underside view, sometimes just the upper side, and if you're lucky, here is a yellow pansy and a nice view of it. But often certain prominent characteristics are hidden, such as the bright blue spot on this yellow pansy, which is not visible in some postures, as we can see here. We will look at some of the main identification characteristics individually. Let's look at the first characteristic, size. Typically a butterfly will not sit still for you to measure it, so that is somewhat impractical. But comparing it visually against a known object such as your hand is much easier. So we get palm size, thumb size, nail size, and so on. Just for comparison purposes, here are images of South Africa's largest and smallest butterfly. The next characteristic that is useful is shape. While many of you younger people had to endure these, there was real value in understanding shape. Let's look at tails. Does the butterfly have tails? If so, 1, 2 or 3 tails? Are they sturdy or hair tails? Do they look like swallowtails or a lobe tail? Here are some real examples of lobe tails, swordtails, and 3 sturdy tails. And we also have some flimsy hair tails. What about the general shape of the wings? Now this is a bit tricky because it is more visible with set specimens, but a little bit of mental restructuring can well assist. How about the margins of the wing? Concave or convex? Are the wing edges smooth, scalloped or toothed? Are the wings elongated? Here are some real butterfly images. Note the overall shape and the margins. And here are a few elongated wings. To summarize shape, here are a few more. Color is arguably the characteristic most identified with butterflies, and any color will do. Other important considerations for identifications are where they are flying and what they are doing. Some species are only found in or near forests, choosing dark areas to hide in. Hiding on a grass blade, the Zulus find camouflage. And on hilltops in the bushveld, emperors and sapphires chase one another. Some butterflies prefer marshy areas, and almost any rocky ridge is adorned by one of the commodores. In the Cape, the opals often patrol dry riverbeds, and on higher mountains, the Table Mountain Beauty or a Painted Lady always offer a spectacular sight. When it comes to behavior, this is often an easy way to get to the nearest group. One should observe their resting posture, such as with flat wings, vertical wings, or V-shaped. Are they flying about on a hilltop, or are they congregating around mud puddles? Fluttering in or out of a bush is a dead giveaway for its gender, and some patrol up and down the same track. Not all feed on flowers, and if so, they may not sit still. Others feed on fruit or dung, and some only fly at some time of the day. For example, if it is sitting with open flat wings, it is most likely a skipper. Swallowtails mostly drink nectar while fluttering about the flower, while some species would never drink from a flower. Others often feed on dung or fruit. Females can often be identified by their search for host plants or, of course, their egg-laying postures. And certain species tend to only fly at certain times of the day. These really smart animals have even found a way to use the natural world efficiently. So, a very similar species can be readily identified by its flight period. In this example, one can see that the Geiger brown typically flies between November and February, while the Drakensberg brown flies from mid-August to late October. Yet, they occur in the same area and look remarkably similar. Similarly, they have also chopped the Earth up in their own unique little patches, so distribution is important, and similar species inhabit simply different regions. In this example, the Protea emperor and the Foxy emperor look very similar, but occur in vastly different areas. Foxy is found in the northern bushveld, whereas the Protea emperor is only found on the mountains of the southern Cape. But these areas may change as humans change their habitat. This species, the white-barred emperor, was only found on the coast and forests of South Africa, but is now often seen in the Highveld and Cape Gardens due to people planting its host plant, the Cape ash or the dog plum tree. The same is true for this blue pansy, which has moved south at a steady pace and previously was restricted further north. This session will not really cover the early stages, except to highlight that these can also assist in identification. As is the case in these policemen, where the two species are virtually impossible to separate as adults, but the caterpillars are extremely dissimilar. In this case, the brown-veined white can be separated from the forest white by the fact that the one lays its eggs singly and the other in a cluster. So these are some of the main characteristics to include in your identification ritual. But remember, sometimes you can identify by recognizing what it is not. And also remember that butterflies did not study the reference books, so they may have a trick or two up their sleeves. Before we proceed, I will throw in a little tidbit about butterfly groups or families. It is not the intention of this video to go into detail regarding this. But the grouping is not random. If we can place a butterfly in a group, the search in the book is that much faster. There are 6 groups, namely the swallowtails, the whites, the brush-footed butterflies, the blues, the skippers, and the metal marks. This is in Africa, of course. A very general description for these are: the swallowtails are generally large, palm-sized. Many have lobe tails or saw tails, and they generally flutter while feeding. The whites are generally white or yellow, often feed on flowers, and are typically half-palm size. The brush-footed butterflies are mostly the same size or up to 3/4 of palm size, and are often more earthy, orange-brown colored, but vary greatly. The blues are very small, on average maybe thumbnail size to half a thumb size, and are very often blue, but some groups are orange or brown. The skippers are fast-flying, generally cryptic, and of course skips along. Some are crepuscular, meaning they are most active at dawn or dusk. The metal marks, mostly called Judies in Africa, only have a few species in Africa and are mostly found in forested areas. Okay, so now we know a bit about grouping them in a rudimentary fashion. But of course, there are many exceptions and complications. One way of identifying is the use of wing patterns. There are a few very often used patterns, such as center wing bars, wing corner adornments, and so on. Amazingly, similar patterns occur across the different families, but are generally best to differentiate between similar species, not as a way to group at a higher level. And sometimes the differences are simply minimal. And the great photo you have just taken just doesn't show the one characteristic that you actually needed. When seeing mating pairs, one can generally distinguish the female as the one being dragged along, but not in all species, just like humans. Sometimes the females look the same with only small differences, but other times they are vastly different. We will leave some explanation for this into another video. Even more confusing is that some species look different in one season than another. And to add to the confusion, they wear out from this to this. In our next video, we will look at an example of mimicry, an example of easy to confuse species, and possibly the tips. In future, we will try and focus on difficult to identify species, but will probably only tackle species that you are likely to encounter. Bear in mind that we will focus on South Africa, not because we are partial, but it does help to use a limited set to identify from, especially as this session is about learning the techniques of identification, not actually doing the identification. Now it is time to go out and see some butterflies. To hone your skills, go to Facebook or iNaturalist and try to identify some for yourself. Don't be scared to use the materials that you own to assist. If you like videos like this and have not done so yet, please subscribe to the channel. It will greatly help us. If you have enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up. And if you want to be notified of the next one, hit the notification button.